The life of Leonardo da Vinci. Before we start, let's consider a few questions. Think to yourself, what do you know about Leonardo da Vinci? Where was he from? Where did he live? What kind of jobs did he do? What is he famous for? So, Leonardo da Vinci, as most people know, he was a painter. The problem is that most people think he was only a painter, but he was not only that. He did a lot of other different jobs. He was a sculptor too. One of the most famous of his sculptures was a horse that he made out of clay with the intent to make it in bronze later. But unfortunately, during the time of war, at that time, the horse was totally destroyed. So now we don't have that sculpture to appreciate. However, he was a great sculptor and everybody admired Leonardo da Vinci's horse at that time. He was also an engineer, but not only in civil engineering, but he also worked with other types of engineering, especially in the field of mechanics, for example, making machines and stuff like that. He was also an inventor, right? So he created several different machines and inventions, like the airplane, for example, the helicopter, the war tank, and several other machines and things. Just bear in mind here that we have the Wright brothers who created the airplane in 1903, and we had Santos Dumont, who also invented the airplane 3 years later in 1906. But Leonardo da Vinci, according to many biographers, he was the first person to come up with the idea of creating an airplane. So he didn't actually make it, but he made sketches and he made it. It was clear in his mind that it was possible for a human to create a flying machine. That was the way it was called at the time, because the word airplane didn't exist yet. So although the Wright brothers and Santos Dumont were the real inventors of the airplane, Leonardo da Vinci was probably the first person who came up with the idea and designing an airplane. He was also an architect, so he was very important in the building of churches, cathedrals, and all the buildings, especially bridges too, especially in Italy. He was also a scientist, but of course not the scientist we know today, because there were no microscopes at that time. But he was a scientist because he was very curious and very interested in researching plants, animals, and several of the living things at that time. He wrote hundreds of notebooks about his researches. He was also a musician. He played a musical instrument called the lute, which was similar to a flute, and he used that to entertain the Duke of Milan and the King of France. So he was a very influential person in the field of music too. He was also a mathematician, of course, not like Einstein, but he was a good mathematician, and he used his mathematics in some of his works, which I'm going to tell you later. He was also an anatomist as well. So Leonardo da Vinci, he cut open over 30 corpses in order to investigate people's internal organs and to see how they function. He also studied the bones of the human body, so he was extremely curious about everything. And he wanted to know all the details about the human body. Now I have a question for you. Think about it. Considering only the fields of mathematics and anatomy, how do you think he used those, he used this knowledge to paint? Just think about it. Like, why do you think Leonardo da Vinci was such a great painter? If you really consider, you're going to find out that he used his mathematics and his anatomy, his knowledge in both of these fields to paint his paintings, right? So he would measure every tiny detail of the painting using his mathematics knowledge, especially the golden rule. So some say that Leonardo da Vinci applied the golden rule in order to make more perfect paintings. And of course, in anatomy, because he not only studied the bones of the human body, but also the muscles, he knew almost every single muscle of the body, then he could paint better, because he would first paint from the view of the muscles on the person's face and the neck, and then later he would paint the skin over the muscles. So that's one more reason why Leonardo da Vinci's paintings were so realistic. He was also a geologist, and we can see that from some of his paintings, in which we can see rocks that he painted, such as some of them I'm going to show you later at the end of the presentation. He was also an astronomer, and he was a botanist too, which you can also see in his paintings and also in his drawings, right? So you have to consider that Leonardo da Vinci was also a person who drew very well. He was, and in his several of his notebooks, we can see drawings I'm going to show you later. He was also a writer, right? And he was a historian, so he told some of the facts that happened during his time, which today are historical records. And he was also a cartographer. One of the most, probably the most intriguing map that Leonardo da Vinci created was the map of Imola in Italy. And according to his biographers, and according to the map we have today, it was just incredible how someone could draw such a perfect map of the whole area, of the whole of Imola. And he did that so that it could be used during the war at that time. We have to consider that Leonardo da Vinci lived at a time in which war was commonplace in Italy, especially in Milan, right? So he was born in a city called Vinci, and that's why his name is, today we call him as Leonardo da Vinci, and even at that time too, his first name is Leonardo. Da means of, right? And Vinci is the name of the town where Leonardo was born. So he's being known as Leonardo da Vinci, or Leonardo from the town of Vinci. And then he moved to Florence, where he studied with Verrocchio, who was one of the most brilliant, one of the most bright minds at that time. And it was very important for him to meet and work with Verrocchio in his studio. Not only because of the time of his life, because that was from 14 to 20, right? So that is a very crucial period of time in a person's life, from which we can learn and evolve our thoughts and learn several different techniques. For example, he learned at that time sculpting, painting, drawing, and he even in Verrocchio's studio he even learned how to melt metals, how to work on carpentry. So he knew how to work with wood. So he learned all of those techniques from Verrocchio in his studio at that time, and he was lucky that his father afforded to pay for the training, for those 6 years of training there. Leonardo's childhood was also extremely important for his development, because in Vinci, in the little town of Vinci, there were several hills, there were a few caves, there were several trees, plants, and wildlife everywhere, and he had an uncle who had a lot of free time and was very interested in taking Leonardo to stroll around his hometown. So Leonardo was very much influenced by the nature around him early in his life, from the first years onwards. And there's a story that goes that he went into a cave nearby, and we don't know much about what happened inside that cave, but some biographers, they say that he saw a whale, like the bones of a whale that was inside the cave, and that sparkled his imagination, like how come the bones of a whale be here, you know, inside a cave. And well, and so there are several facts, like several little facts that happened to Leonardo da Vinci during his early years that give us some background of how he developed such great intelligence and curiosity and creativity. So let's take a look at some of his drawings. This is the Vitruvian Man, right, which shows his intention to make all the people perceive the human body as something perfect, and also the mix of anatomy and measurements and geometry, which was something that Leonardo da Vinci really enjoyed, geometry. And we can see here the human body inside of a square, which is inside of a circle, and he was trying to find that perfection in the human body within geometry. We can see here on the left some of one of his drawings on mussels, right? The flight of birds, right? So before he developed the airplane, I mean the flying machine as he called it, he was studying how birds could fly. This is a drawing of a fetus, which is just incredible, and we can see all of his annotations, right? So he would not only draw, but he would also write every tiny detail that he perceived on the things that he would draw, right? Here more drawings on bones and muscles. This one is a war machine, right? Like one of the war machines that he developed at the time. This one here is about hydraulics, right? So he also studied the movements of water and how it could be used in producing force, right? Here, this is one of his drawings of the flying machine, right? One of his attempts to create an airplane. This one, it's a helicopter, right? So this is one of his famous drawings on how he perceived a helicopter could be made. He also invented the bicycle and the submarine, and according to Leonardo da Vinci, he didn't want to publish those things, especially the submarine, because he believed that whoever took hold of that scheme and that drawing would probably develop the idea and use it in war. And Leonardo da Vinci was, it's kind of paradoxical that he worked on war machines, but at the same time, he did not seem to be a violent person. He was just, because of the time, so he got influenced by that idea of war, but he did not seem to be a person who would be willing to kill a lot of people, no way at all. He was even vegetarian, actually, because he didn't even want to kill animals for eating, so he would eat only plants. All right, basically that's the general idea I wanted to share with you on how diversely talented Leonardo da Vinci was. He's considered until today to be one of the most intelligent and diversely talented person who has ever lived. And I think it was important for us to see how that happened, right? How he developed such great intelligence and creativity. We can see a lot of connections with his childhood and his teenagehood, right? So this is something very important for parents to consider when upbringing their children. They have to bear in mind that the childhood they're going to give their children is going to mark their lives, and it's going to create who they're going to be for the rest of their lives.